Vilgax turns to Ben, seeing how Kevin was still helping him a bit, and took note that he was injured, which would explain why exactly he didn't interfere with the battle, and tells them that he will give them one Earth rotation before returning, and then they will do battle to decide the fate of the Earth. If he does not show, he will exercise his legal right and destroy the planet before he and Siphon vanished, leaving them to recover. Damn it! Ben called out as he slid down onto his knees and hit the ground, cracking the pavement with his armored fist. Why did it have to be now while I'm still injured? He then slowly stood up, frustrated, but decided that it wasn't the time to sulk. Instead, he'd have work to do, and slowly began to walk, more like limp, to Kevin's car. Where are you going? Gwen questioned as Ben turned to look over his shoulder for a moment. He asked if she and Lucy could help get Max and the others to the recovery ward, though Lucy asked what exactly he was going to do, and Ben says that he's going to see an old friend of his. Then asked Kevin if he could drive them there, to which they'd agreed, and off the two of them went, with Gwen sighing as she'd helped get the plumber's helpers and Max into the rust bucket to get them to the plumber hospital. Kevin then drives Ben off as he tells Kevin where to go exactly, though this part of Bellwood was kind of deserted, and sorta gave them the creeps. They kept going. Ben tells them to pull into what appeared to be an abandoned school building with a large open garage, and told them to pull up into that spot. He does as Ben had asked, and then the building began to shake and rattle as they were then lowered downwards as if on some sort of hydraulic elevator, and as they got lower they started to see what was the beginnings of a city underneath them, and that they were being lowered towards. Once at the bottom, Ben said to drive and began giving him directions to a place that looked a lot nicer than the other buildings, and went on inside. Inside they meet a Tetraman there with one hand missing, and a patch over their top right eye. They'd greeted them and asked how their most famous customer has been, and Ben says that he's been better, but needed a few upgrades to the armor, to which they'd nodded and said they heard Vilgax's challenge, and also told Ben that they'd been working on something for a couple of years now. The stuff he'd brought him to develop new weapons and tools really helped with that. Though it was going to be expensive, Ben says he'd pay whatever so long as it would help them deal with Vilgax. And the Tetraman Forge Master nodded and began to get to work on upgrading Ben's existing armor to something new and stronger. Ben stands up onto a platform where the upgrades to the armor were applied, while still red hot, melting through the old set and bonding with it while he grunted in pain but refused to move from that spot until it was ready, and molded to his body type. Struck again and again by a powerful hammer by the Tetraman Forge Master, he continued to grunt out in pain. Kevin could barely watch how the armor was upgraded, seeing Ben in pain but being unable to help. The Forge Master told Ben it might help if he'd actually yelled out from the pain, to which Ben spat blood on their face, with a deadly look in his eye. One Kevin hoped he'd never have to see again, as it made him retreat from the room lest he be caught in Ben's wrath. The Forge Master smirked and struck the armor again in the front torso, telling Ben that it's good he hasn't lost that intent. After he'd finished beating the armor around Ben's body to shape and mold it to his figure, they'd pulled a lever and a humanoid-shaped mold pressed downward around him, as a searing, see-through, bubbling liquid was poured into the top, encasing Ben while he was still inside of it, and then icy air so cold that snow had formed from it blasted from the top of the forge, cooling down everything in an instant, along with freezing the mold around Ben as the molding tray was removed. He was sealed inside of a clear liquid before it began to crack, and Ben broke his way out. After he'd broken out of it, Ben smirked under the new helmet, ready to test out the armor with the deadly look in his eye. Time to go to work. He spoke, turning to the Forge Master and telling them that their payment would be transferred immediately, then called up his bank to wire the money. Afterwards, he walked out in the new armor, shining like the sun, glistening, as beautiful as new-fallen snow in the sunrise. Along the way, Ben had been called by Max, who said that while he was still injured, he should leave Vilgax to him. However, Ben reminds Max that the Conqueror's Challenge specifically asked for their greatest champion, which would be him. He also told Max that Vilgax called him out specifically, and not to worry because he'd be able to handle it. They got back to the area where there were now cameras set up all over the place outside the dome. Siphon tells the people of Earth that the battle would be broadcast all over every channel on the planet, and if their champion does not show show, Vilgax will exercise his legal right and destroy the Earth. Gwen was watching worriedly from the sidelines with Lucy as they saw Kevin's car pulling up and went over to see if Ben was ready for that. Ben gets out of the car, and the girls couldn't help but stare. The new armor set showed off his natural physique better than the old set, and they couldn't help but compare him to a knight in shining armor. As he walked confidently through the barrier ready to fight, he called out to Siphon, telling him that he's here and demands Vilgax show himself. Siphon says, "As you wish," and teleports away as Vilgax comes raining down in a ball of flame, slamming into the ground in front of Ben, who'd stood there unmoving and unyielding in the slightest. Vilgax then calls out, "Benjamin Tennyson, I am here to kill you and conquer your world," with Julie off to the side recording what she could without being caught by the cops and being told to move away like the rest of the civilians. The cops had tried with Kevin, Gwen, and Lucy, but they showed their powers and the cops backed away. Vilgax asked Ben if he's ready to die, to which he responds, "Seems like a good day to do so." As he'd cracked his knuckles and popped his back, stretching, the Chimera Sui says that they admire Ben's willingness to face death so easily, but he reminds them that he's faced death numerous times. It's all part of the job. The two of them then begin to fight, with Vilgax slamming a large fist down at Ben, but he'd punched Vilgax in the fist. At the same time, though Ben had been dug into the ground, he'd stayed unyielding and unmoving from that spot. The two continued fighting, with Ben avoiding the blasts from his eyes and the ruby by changing into Big Chill, though Vilgax grabbed Ben, activating the yellow crystal on his opposite hand, and unleashed a shock to his system, making his wings jut out and drop. Ben coughs as he was on the ground and changed back to human form. Vilgax lifts up Ben in his new armor, telling him that even the new armor can't save him, to which Ben responds that it's not supposed to. Then the armor begins to heat up, burning the tyrant's hand and making him let go. Growing angry, Vilgax slammed both hands against Ben, sending him flying backwards and slamming into the ground as his helmet had gone flying off, with Ben standing up, lip busted, and gave Vilgax a glare. This glare that Ben had given them made the tyrant's blood run cold, as if he'd felt as if he continued onward. Ben would not hesitate to kill him this time. Even so, he'd refused to give up after coming so far, and against his better judgment continued beating Ben, throwing him around, slamming him against the barrier and against the ground, further damaging his face as one eye now was bloodied, but again he'd stood. Even with the damaged eye growing darker and bruising, with the tears of blood running from it, he'd stood. Vilgax demands to know where Ben's stupid quips were, those lame insults, that pompous attitude from the last time they'd fought, but Ben says nothing, only spits out some blood from his mouth and activates the Omnitrix, changing into Chroma Stone and blasting him against the barrier wall, repeatedly firing over and over again, with Vilgax beginning to struggle to stand. Growing frustrated, he'd resorted to using the sword as Ben was about to strike him again, slamming it against them as hard as they could, shattering Chroma Stone in the process. Gwen called out to Ben as the pieces then dropped onto the ground, and Siphon, smiling darkly, he walked over and lifts up the Omnitrix symbol that was on Chroma Stone, offering to his master, who'd looked triumphant. The Omnitrix began to glow as the bits and pieces of Chroma Stone began to reattach to it, knocking back both Vilgax and Siphon, as Gwen was crying and Julie looked shocked that really was Ben, and that he'd been changing into those alien creatures. The others were comforting Gwen, and the military was ready to move just in case, though what they could do no one was really sure. In an almost blinding flash, a new, or rather old form had appeared, ready to take on Vilgax, the form of Diamond Head. Vilgax growled out and charged towards Ben as he'd stood there cracking his knuckles before making his hand shift into that of Spike's, running off towards Vilgax. At the same time, there was a loud impact sound as dust kicked up around them from the power of the impact, and a single ray had been shot from the dust around them. Slowly, the dust begins to clear, and Ben has one arm shattered against the shield created by the yellow stone, with a hole blown completely through his shoulder. The other arm was covered in something. As a single drop dipped down from the spike, Vilgax's shield flickered out. As his arms began to go limp and he'd fallen to his knees, a very thin, barely visible line began to appear around his neck, as he slowly began to fall backwards with the line growing thicker as a pool of green-colored blood spilled forth from it, and upon impact with the ground, rolled away from his body. Ben, still in the form of Diamond Head, looked out into all the cameras around them with that dangerous look in his eye, the look that made Vilgax's blood run cold. He then began to speak. Let that be a lesson to any that threaten to destroy my world. I will not hesitate if countless lives are at stake. He then walks off to where his helmet had gone and changed back to human form, putting it on.